Imagine this. You're sitting in a quiet room and suddenly you feel a strange tug inside. A part of you you've never met before wants to speak. It's unfamiliar, maybe even terrifying, but it's there. This is what Carl Jung called your shadow. The hidden part of you. The you that you don't want others or even yourself to see. Now, what if I told you that embracing this shadow is the key to becoming the person you're most afraid to be, but also the person you're meant to be? Stay with me, because today we're diving into 5 Carl Jung shadow principles that could change your life forever. I promise, by the end of this journey, you won't look at yourself the same way again. Let's start with something that might sound uncomfortable. You are not who you think you are. This is where Carl Jung's first principle comes alive. Every single one of us has a shadow. And before you click away thinking, I don't have a shadow, I'm a good person, let me stop you. The shadow isn't just your bad side. It's every single part of you that you've stuffed into the basement of your mind because you were too afraid to deal with it. Your anger, your jealousy, your shame, but also your hidden creativity, potential, and power. Jung said, and I quote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." Here's an experiment for you. Grab a piece of paper right now. Yes, right now, and write down something you've always felt ashamed of. Maybe it's a mistake you made years ago. Maybe it's a personality trait you can't stand about yourself. Now, hold that paper in your hands. Look at it. This is what Jung called bringing the unconscious to consciousness. Because, let's face it, most of us spend our entire lives running from these parts of ourselves. But what happens when we stop running? What happens when, instead of hiding from the shadow, we confront it? Click subscribe to this channel to get more insights into human psychology. Here's the crazy thing. Jung believed that if you don't face your shadow, it will control you. Think about it. Have you ever snapped at someone and then felt horrible afterward? That wasn't the real you, right? But what if it was? What if that anger was a part of you that you've ignored for so long that it had no choice but to explode? Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Let that sink in for a second. So how do we start facing the shadow? This brings us to the next principle. The shadow is not your enemy. I know what you're thinking. How can all those parts of me I hate not be my enemy? Here's the deal. The shadow only becomes dangerous when you repress it. Think of it like a beach ball you're trying to hold underwater. The harder you push it down, the more forceful it will pop back up. So instead of fighting it, Jung suggested we need to integrate it. Integration doesn't mean you let your shadow take over. It means you recognize it, understand it, and work with it. Because once you do, something incredible happens. Those parts of you that seemed like weaknesses can actually become your greatest strengths. Let me tell you about an experiment you can try. Next time you feel an ugly emotion, anger, jealousy, fear, don't push it away. Instead, ask yourself, what is this feeling trying to tell me? Maybe your anger is pointing to a boundary that's being crossed. Maybe your jealousy is showing you something you deeply desire but haven't admitted to yourself. Jung believed that every emotion, no matter how painful, carries a message. Are you willing to listen? Now, let's go deeper. Here's where things get really interesting. Jung's third principle is this. Your shadow is the key to your greatest potential. Imagine for a second that everything you've ever wanted to become the confident version of you, the creative version of you, the version of you that finally feels free is locked behind a door. And the key to that door is your shadow. Why? Because the shadow isn't just the parts of you you dislike. It's also the parts of you you've never dared to explore. Jung called this the gold in the shadow. He believed that within the parts of us we suppress lies untapped creativity, energy, and even genius. Think about it. How many times have you held yourself back because you were afraid of what people would think? Maybe you didn't speak up in a meeting because you were afraid of sounding stupid. Maybe you didn't pursue a dream because you were afraid of failing. That fear, that hesitation, that's your shadow. But here's the twist. On the other side of that fear is your power. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and to do that, you need to face the parts of yourself you're most afraid of." Let me give you a practical way to start unlocking this potential. Try this tonight before you go to bed. Grab a journal and write down one thing you're afraid to admit about yourself. Maybe it's a desire you've been ignoring. Maybe it's a fear you've been running from. Whatever it is, get it out of your head and onto paper. This simple act of acknowledgement is the first step toward integration. Now, I know this sounds intense, and it is. Shadow work isn't easy, it's messy, and it's uncomfortable. But here's the thing. The more you face your shadow, the less power it has over you. Jung believed that when we integrate our shadow, we become whole. And when we're whole, we're free. Free to be ourselves. Free to live authentically. Free to stop pretending to be someone we're not. So, let me ask you, what part of yourself are you most afraid to face? Because that's where your journey begins. Great. Let's keep diving deeper. If you've made it this far, it means you're ready to confront parts of yourself that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. And that's powerful. But remember, this isn't about perfection or fixing yourself. It's about understanding yourself, every flawed, messy, brilliant part of you. Let's continue with Carl Jung's fourth shadow principle. The shadow thrives in denial but shrinks in awareness. Think about the last time you felt triggered. Maybe someone said something that set you off, or maybe you found yourself judging someone harshly for something they did. Here's a hard truth. When you feel that heat of judgment or emotional reaction, you're often projecting your own shadow onto someone else. Jung called projection the mechanism by which we disown our shadow. Instead of acknowledging our flaws or insecurities, we see them in others. It's easier to point fingers than to look in the mirror. Here's an experiment for you. The next time you catch yourself judging someone, whether it's their behavior, their personality, or even their success, pause and ask yourself, what does this say about me? For example, if you can't stand someone who's overly confident, could it be that you've repressed your own confidence? If you're annoyed by someone's laziness, is it possible you've buried your own desire to take a break? Jung believed that projection is like holding up a mirror to your own shadow. Once you recognize it for what it is, you can start to take ownership of it. But let's not stop there. Let's explore why denial of the shadow is so dangerous. Jung warned that the more we deny the shadow, the more it controls us from the unconscious. He used the metaphor of the two-faced self. On the surface, we present a polished persona, the mask we wear to fit into society. But beneath the persona lies the shadow, waiting for moments of weakness to slip through the cracks. Imagine living a life where you're constantly at war with yourself, pretending to be one thing while suppressing another. That's not living, that's surviving. Here's where things get intense. Jung believed that the shadow doesn't just affect us individually, it affects the world around us. Think about it. Wars, prejudice, intolerance, their core, these are collective shadows. When entire societies deny or repress certain aspects of their humanity, those shadows manifest on a massive scale, often with devastating consequences. Jung said, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. So when you do your shadow work, it's not just for you, it's for everyone around you. By confronting your own darkness, you become a source of light for others." Now, let's talk about something that might make you uncomfortable. Fear. Fear is the gatekeeper of the shadow. It's the reason we avoid looking at ourselves too deeply. But here's the twist. Fear is also a compass. It points directly to the parts of ourselves we need to confront. Jung believed that our greatest personal growth often lies on the other side of our greatest fears. He said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And while that might sound daunting, it's also liberating, because when you face your fears, you realize they're not as powerful as they seemed. Let me tell you a story. A young man once came to a Jungian therapist, struggling with crippling self-doubt. He felt like a fraud in his career, his relationships, and his life. When they dug deeper, they discovered that his shadow was full of repressed anger and ambition. Growing up, he was taught that anger was bad and that ambition was selfish, so he buried those parts of himself. But in doing so, he also buried his confidence and drive. Through shadow work, he began to reconnect with these parts of himself, not as enemies, but as allies. He learned to express his anger in healthy ways, standing up for himself when needed. And he embraced his ambition, channeling it into meaningful goals. The result? He stopped feeling like a fraud because he was no longer hiding from himself. This brings us to a practical exercise you can try. It's called active imagination, a technique Jung developed to communicate with the unconscious. Here's how it works. Find a quiet place where you won't be disturbed. Close your eyes and bring to mind a part of yourself you've been avoiding. Maybe it's a fear, a desire, or even a memory. Now, imagine that part of you taking on a form. Maybe it's a person, an animal, or even a shape. Have a conversation with it. Ask it why it's there, what it wants, and what it's trying to teach you. Don't overthink it. Just let the answers come. This might feel strange at first, but it's a powerful way to bring the unconscious into the conscious. Now, let's move to Jung's fifth and final principle. Shadow integration is the path to authenticity. What does it mean to be authentic? Most people think it means being true to yourself, but how can you be true to yourself if you don't even know who you are? Jung believed that authenticity comes from wholeness. And wholeness means embracing all parts of yourself. The good, the bad, and the ugly. He said, "I'd rather be whole than good." Let that sink in. In a world that's constantly telling us to be good or perfect, Jung is reminding us that true freedom comes from being whole. Here's a question for you. What would your life look like if you stopped trying to be good and started trying to be whole? What if you allowed yourself to feel every emotion, even the uncomfortable ones? What if you gave yourself permission to want what you truly want, even if it scares you? This is the essence of shadow work. It's not about becoming someone else, it's about becoming more of who you already are. Let's do one final experiment. Think of a time when you felt completely alive, like you were truly yourself, without any masks or pretenses. What were you doing? Who were you with? How did it feel? Now ask yourself, what's stopping you from feeling that way more often? Chances are it's your shadow. Maybe it's fear of judgment, fear of failure, or fear of success. Whatever it is, remember this. The shadow only has power when you ignore it. When you face it, it transforms. And so do you. So, here's the challenge. Are you willing to face your shadow? Are you willing to confront the parts of yourself you've been running from? Because if you are, you're not just stepping into the unknown, you're stepping into your potential. Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, but it's also the most liberating." And I promise, on the other side of that fear is a version of you that's more powerful, more creative, and more alive than you've ever imagined. Let's revisit an important idea. The shadow is not something you get rid of, it's something you integrate. This is where most people misunderstand Jung's work. They think shadow integration means fixing yourself or curing the parts of you that feel broken. But Jung was clear. The shadow isn't a problem to solve. It's a companion to accept. He said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Think about that for a second. True growth doesn't happen by pretending to be perfect. It happens when we shine a light on the parts of ourselves we've been too scared to face." Here's the paradox. The more you try to fight your shadow, the stronger it gets. Imagine you're in a swimming pool, trying to hold a beach ball underwater. You can do it for a while, but eventually it's going to pop back up. And when it does, it'll probably smack you in the face. That's exactly how the shadow works. The more you repress it, the more it builds pressure in your unconscious. And when it finally forces its way to the surface, it often shows up in ways you can't control. An outburst of anger, a moment of self-sabotage, or even a recurring dream that haunts you. Jung believed these moments are the shadow's way of demanding to be seen. Let me tell you about a famous psychological experiment that illustrates this. In the 1970s, psychologist Daniel Wegner conducted a study where he asked participants to not think about a white bear. Predictably, the more participants tried to suppress the thought of the white bear, the more it dominated their minds. This phenomenon is known as ironic process theory, and it's the same principle that applies to the shadow. The more you try to suppress it, the more it controls you. So the solution isn't suppression, it's acknowledgement. Now, let's talk about shadow integration in action. Imagine someone who's always the nice guy or the nice girl. They avoid conflict at all costs, always putting others' needs ahead of their own. On the surface, this might seem admirable. But beneath that nice persona often lies a shadow full of anger, resentment, and unmet needs. Over time, this repressed shadow might manifest as passive aggressiveness, chronic stress, or even physical illness. The solution isn't for the person to stop being kind. It's for them to acknowledge the parts of themselves that also feel anger, frustration, and the desire to say no. By integrating those parts, they can become more authentic. Not just nice, but whole. Here's an exercise you can try. Think of a personality trait you pride yourself on. Maybe it's your kindness, your intelligence, or your work ethic. Now ask yourself, what's the shadow side of that trait? If you're kind, do you sometimes suppress your own needs? If you're intelligent, do you sometimes look down on others? If you're hardworking, do you sometimes neglect rest or relationships? This exercise isn't about criticizing yourself. It's about recognizing that every strength has a shadow. And by acknowledging that shadow, you can use your strengths more consciously. Now, let's take it a step further. Jung believed that shadow integration isn't just about individual growth. It's about collective transformation. He warned that when people deny their shadows on a large scale, those shadows can spill out into society in destructive ways. Think about history. How many atrocities have been committed because entire groups of people projected their shadows onto others. Racism, war, persecution, these are all examples of collective shadow projection. Jung said, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you do not know, the world will tell you. This is why shadow work isn't just personal, it's global. The more we confront our own darkness, the less likely we are to project it onto others." But let's bring this back to you, because at the end of the day, shadow work is deeply personal. It's about looking in the mirror and asking, who am I, really? And that's not an easy question to answer. Jung believed that most people spend their entire lives avoiding it. Why? Because it's scary. It's scary to admit that you're not as perfect as you'd like to be. It's scary to confront the parts of yourself that you've been running from. But here's the thing. The parts of yourself you're most afraid to face are often the parts with the most power to transform you. Let me give you a real-world example of how this works. There's a technique in Jungian therapy called dream analysis. Jung believed that dreams are a direct line to the unconscious, and that the symbols in our dreams often represent shadow elements. For example, let's say you dream about being chased by a monster. On the surface, it's just a scary dream. But Jung would ask, what does the monster represent? What part of yourself are you running from? Often the monster isn't an external threat, it's a symbol of your own repressed fears or desires. By confronting the monster in your dream or in your waking life, you can begin to integrate the part of yourself it represents. Here's an exercise you can try tonight. Before you go to bed, write down a question for your unconscious mind. Something like, what part of myself do I need to understand better then? Keep a notebook by your bed and write down any dreams you have. Don't try to interpret them right away. Just record them. Over time, you might start to notice patterns or symbols that point to parts of your shadow. This is your unconscious speaking to you. Are you willing to listen? Now, let's talk about what happens when you fully integrate your shadow. Jung believed that shadow integration leads to what he called individuation. Individuation is the process of becoming your true self, not the self you were taught to be, not the self society expects you to be, but the self you were born to be. It's the ultimate goal of Jungian psychology, and it's what allows you to live authentically and fully. But here's the catch. Individuation isn't a destination. It's a journey. There will always be new layers of the shadow to uncover, new parts of yourself to integrate. Jung once said, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown shadow work isn't about solving yourself. It's about growing into yourself. And that process never ends." So, let me ask you one final question. Who are you afraid to become? Because the answer to that question is the key to everything. The person you're afraid to become is the person who's buried in your shadow. And when you embrace that person, you don't just become who you're meant to be. You become free. This is your journey. And it starts now.